Welcome back, everybody. It's water pump time for 1113. We're going to get a start on that today, but first I'm going to get the valve cover put on top of the cylinder head and work on closing some more of that off. So valve cover is ready to go. Here's the gasket, bought it new from Cat. Part number is 4B3438. That is the same number that is in the old manual, so that has not changed. Now there are a couple of additions I choose to make to these early tractors to seal the fasteners a little bit better that hold the valve cover on. These early tractors just have this heavy washer and, like we discussed before, the cap nuts that go on top of them. And if you consult the parts manual, there were no other means of sealing any of those components up on top of the cover. They just put the heavy steel washer with the cap nut on, no gaskets, no seals, no anything, just the valve cover gasket down at the base. So what I like to do, this is what I choose to do, I cut little cork rings that will go around those heavy washers. That seals the base of the washer down to the valve cover a little bit better. And then I put these copper sealing rings beneath the cap nuts, which will also seal the base of those a little bit. Usually there's plenty of room to put those in. It's just a little bit of an extra method that I choose to do to help to prevent any kind of dust, moisture, contaminants, anything else from being pulled in from around those holes in the top of the valve cover. Little tip, something I like to do, I'll put sealer on the cylinder head side of that valve cover gasket. That way the gasket will stick down to the head, and when you take the valve cover back off to do the cylinder head retorque and reset the valve lash and everything else, this gasket will act as an oil dam and keep that oil from running all over the place. Cuts down on the mess, makes life a little bit easier to boot. So let's get these pieces on. The heavy washers also act to center the valve cover around the studs. Drop those copper sealing rings on next. And start the cap nuts. And it's looking like the studs that we trimmed down in the last episode are a very, very good length, because the cap nuts are starting on without any trouble, and they're certainly not sticking up high enough to bottom out on the inside. You just have to tighten these things down until you are exerting adequate pressure on the gasket. I've been into a few of these tractors where the top of the valve cover is caved in. When you sight down that line, you can kind of see it dip all the way. That's from people tightening it way too much, probably trying to overcome a gasket that should just be replaced, trying to cinch it tighter and tighter until they have no more leaks. But valve cover's on. Let's move on to the water pump. So the plan with this today is just to give it a good once over and make sure it's all in good condition. We're just trying to make these things as good as we can possibly have them. So we'll get into it, make sure it's got good bearings. We'll replace the grease seal while we're in there. Check out the shaft for wear beneath the packing nut. Make sure the impeller is still tight and in good condition. Just give it just an all-around once over. You can start by just making sure none of the fan blades are loose, because they are riveted onto that center spider. That's good. And speaking of fan blades, this is another one of those first generation components right here. You can see tractors 5J1 to 5J1412 had the smaller fan blades. From 14, 13 and up, they went to much larger blades. So this is the early style with these blades that are not very wide. They come out to a point. They were replaced with this. You can see the blades were dang near doubled in size, probably even a little bit more than that if you calculated surface area. So this would be a direct bolt-on replacement to this early one, but as is the case with everything else, we're keeping this early style because it's just so darn cool. Alright, so disassembly process. The impeller shaft goes all the way through the pump, and it is loosely splined to the center of the fan hub and pinned to it as well. The pin is beneath this little cap on the front. So you need to carefully get back behind it and pry it off. There we are. Now we need to locate the pin. Fortunately, It's not a taper pin. They're usually not peened over. They're just kind of a light press fit. They can be driven out fairly easily. There's the pin. Got a bit of wear going on. Turn it around here. Next thing I'm going to do is back off the packing nut. That will supposedly reduce the amount of drag that the packing is putting on the impeller shaft. Counterclockwise will back you off. There, we went a couple turns out. Now the impeller shaft can be pulled out. You can see where it's coming out of the fan at the front. Okay, it's just about out. There we are. Take a look at it real quick. You see the splines on this end that engage with the fan hub. Checking the area where the packing rides, and honestly that's not worn too bad. I've seen some that are really nasty in that area. Impeller's nice and tight on there yet. This is held on by a taper pin, and it's usually horrible trying to get those out. So if it's all tight and it looks good like this is, we leave those alone. Now the fan hub can be taken off once the bolts are out. You can see that closes off the bearing compartment in the hub. Have a look at the back side. Splines look pretty good in there. Don't see anything horribly worn, just dirty. Well, it's a lot easier to handle now. I'm just giving things a quick look. One thing I notice is I don't see any fresh grease in here at all. And when you spin it, it sounds a little bit on the dry side, maybe a little bit rough. So we'll get down to the nut that holds this pulley hub on. Get that old dried grease off of there. There's usually, a fold over lock that has to be straightened. There. Lock tab is down flat, but before I loosen that nut, I want to show you the play that I'm detecting in those bearings. That pulley wobbles around pretty good. The same wrench I used for the packing nut, 1 5/16", also fits this hub nut out here. There's the nut. Fold over lock. And the hub comes off of the housing now. I'll finish threading the packing nut off. We'll just have a look at that packing while we have it all apart. Everything in here looks good. That is a bushing that continues on to the back side back here. I'm going to have to get this cleaned up to have a better look at that. We also have a little bit of a felt dust seal in here. Again, we're going to clean this piece, get a better look at those, see if anything else is required. Now to get the bearings and the seal out of the pulley. I can tell you that old seal wasn't doing much. The lip is completely worn away and we've got spring sticking out all the way around, so you can tell by how much grease had purged its way out. That seal wasn't doing any good anymore. So we have 2 ball bearings in here, a spacer in between them, and the way this housing is machined, the outer bearing has to be driven out the front and the inner bearing has to be driven out the rear along with the seal. You can't just take them all down through in one direction, they won't fit. So we'll start with the outer bearing here first, and this sleeve in there can just be pushed off to the side far enough where you can get in there with a punch. I'll just support the front side on this socket right here. Okay, there's the spacer, outer bearing. I just need to scrape enough grease off this back side to be able to see what I'm doing back here. Okay, now that I've excavated down far enough to see what we're dealing with, you can see there's a machine screw on each side of that seal, and they are lightly staked in. Looking through the parts manual, I see they were utilized from 5J1 to 1412. They were also utilized from 1413 to 1705. But beginning with 5J 1706, they deleted those, and they must have finally felt confident that the press fit of that seal would hold itself in. And I was already with the impact driver here thinking these were going to be tight, but I'm pretty sure somebody's had these out before. They were both already loose, so that makes things just a little bit easier. So now I'll drive the bearing and the seal out at the same time, and I'll use the socket for support again. I want to support closely around the bore that those are pressed into, instead of only supporting out here on this thin belt flange out here. Those are easily cracked and broken. So we'll support in close where it's all strong. All right, bearing and the old well-worn seal. Now to finish the disassembly on this pulley hub, I need to thread the adjustable flange off so the lock bolt and nut comes out, and to get the flange entirely off, this grease fitting has to get out of the way. And sometimes these can be pretty stuck. You can see here I've spent some time off camera with some penetrating oil freeing this thing up, getting it to turn by hand. Seems to be coming off pretty well right now. There we go. Not too bad in there. And the flange faces are looking pretty good wear-wise. I've seen them a lot worse. But so you guys know the drill by now. Lots of cleanup to be done. We'll give everything a really good inspection. See you back in a couple hours. All right, welcome back everybody. So everything's been cleaned and inspected, and if you remember from disassembly, I mentioned I was going to clean this whole housing and have a better look at this felt dust seal that was up in here. Really wasn't anything that you missed there, unless you have a cosmoline addiction, kind of like what I suffer from. Fold over lock.